Hi everybody, and welcome to our second video review of our asymmetrical designs for milestone 2. So in the previous assignment we looked at symmetrical designs, which as we discussed and as the readings discuss, symmetrical designs are self-balancing. They just balance themselves because you always have equal weight on the left and the right because you have that mirroring. Now when we go to asymmetrical designs, we actually become the force, you could say, that balances the design. And how do you balance design? Well, you kind of just experiment, really. You kind of look at the left and the right and you just sort of feel whether a design is balanced. How does it feel balanced? I would say in general, we always look to balance. Like that is something, it's another one of those intuitive principles that we tend to kind of like, I'm kind of looking here and I feel like everybody's really pretty close to being balanced. Just kind of, it's nice to see. One of the reasons I always like to put everybody's work up, this is in Adobe Bridge, up on just a board that you can see just the thumbnails, is because when you look at a design really small like this, and I really encourage you to do that, is you can actually sort of see just the basic structure, the lights and the darks, and because sometimes details can, I think, kind of lead us away from the overall, how to really problem solve a design. So I like to do this for my own work too, really stand back from things. But you can kind of sort of see that there's a sense of, does the left and the right feel like it's visually weighted? you know so again, I really feel that it is a principle that we generally like to do in our designs. We gravitate towards that. I think that's all I'm going to mention now. I think we're just going to dive right in and look at everybody's work and see what everyone's been working on. Okay, Danny, let's see. You're not a fan of it, but there are some parts you had fun with. Okay, that's good. Let's take a look. Yeah, well, I actually think it's working quite well, So it's definitely asymmetrical and feels pretty balanced to me. And I think you've done a really nice job here also, working with the ideas that we talked about last week, which we're still, talking about this week, working with the edges of the page and really kind of breaking up that positive negative space. And I like, what you've done here with these units. You sort of have these units of like circles within circles that you've kind of put together. It's always a great way to build a design, is especially in this class, is to kind of create these units that you can then take, and in your case, you sort of riffed on them in different ways. So they've kind of like changed a little bit, but they're sort of built on the same model, and then so you've got that in this section, and then you've gone to kind of like a sort of a riff on circles with little kind of dots around them, sort of like a little stream of those, and then you sort of change to a contrast of these repeating shapes, which is a nice way to work too, is repetition and kind of building little sections, like areas of parts, if that makes sense. Like it creates these kind of patterns that fit together, and everything sort of seems to be flowing in this upward left direction. I feel like this is complete. If you want to keep playing with it, if you're not happy with it, feel free to do so. But I really do think to me, it feels quite resolved and, um, you know, works really well for this particular assignment. Hi, Lori. Yes, in this assignment, you can work with gray. And what's nice about working with gray is that, it really fits in nicely with the black and white already. But what it does give you an opportunity to do is, gives you a little bit more variety of color. Um, and it also is interesting because gray is I think, a slightly different visual weight than black. It can give you a nice sort of defined area that, like the way black can, but it isn't as heavy. So it's an interesting way to kind of work with those, with that sense of balance. Okay, let's see what you have here. You've got sort of interesting area here with some diagonals kind of floating through, which is nice. Like you sort of place free form diagonals that you've just sort of laid just so that it looks kind of random, but it's not. That's what's so interesting about really a lot of design, but especially asymmetrical design, is that a lot of times you create this effortless design that looks kind of random, but when you really try to do that yourself, you realize, oh, it's not so easy to create an asymmetrical design. There's a lot of experimenting and just kind of trying something out, trying different things out. And then you have the circle within a circle here, and then these kind of interesting, more organic shapes, and then all these little dots, which is very nice. I think the way you fit it all together, circles within circles, repeating this little kind of leaf pattern. Again, repetition is often the key when you introduce a new shape into a design. If you introduce more than one instance, like several of them, for example, then it really feels like it belongs in a design. Again, coming back to that principle of unity that we talked about previously. Okay, yeah, to me this feels quite complete as well. So nice job with this. That's interesting. So the idea of bingo, and you wanted to show the life of the balls. Yeah, what I love about abstract designs is that a lot of times people think abstract means that there's nothing there, like in terms of idea or theme or concept. But we know as designers that abstract designs really can have a lot going on in them that we hint at, or, people can read different things into it. But, a lot of times when I'm working abstractly with just shapes, I have all these ideas in mind too of what I'm thinking it reminds me of or what I'm aiming for. So the idea of, that you have, it's interesting to kind of, again, experiment with that, the idea of bingo. Okay, yeah, so this is asymmetrical. Very nicely done, I think. And I also like what you're doing here, what you mentioned too with repeating the same shape. I've been talking about that, and I think that's a great idea here with all of these different shapes here. And the only thing here I would say, maybe I feel like perhaps the triangles, maybe, maybe there were maybe a corner of this perhaps. I'm not sure, but I would say that this is the one thing that doesn't feel quite yet like it belongs. Now, if you added more triangles, like if you took this, maybe made it a bit smaller and made sort of a little row, up here, like kind of like a row of triangles. Or maybe you put triangles here, kind of like little triangles that, you know what I mean? Like a black triangles that kind of connected here, sort of kind of like a little roughly row of triangles. Like you could incorporate the triangle a little more. So I think it could be really great. Like you could kind of make all of these edges little triangles. I don't know, I'm sort of imagining different ways to work with the triangle. So just add in more instances of it, work it into the design a little bit more, or alternately just take it out and maybe add some more of these, circles within circles, or, experiment with more of those, this shape, maybe you could make it smaller and put it somewhere else. Yeah, I think that's all you need to do here is just work with that, see where it takes you. Hi, Ebony. Yes, what you said, how asymmetrical designs can give a composition an unbalanced look, but it is completely balanced in actuality. Yes, that's an interesting point. I think that with asymmetrical designs, and also does, other designs that maybe seem a little more chaotic, they can give the appearance of being unbalanced or chaotic, but they really are, but if they're designed well, they are in fact perfectly unified and perfectly balanced. They have that pleasing quality. A design that's truly chaotic, that doesn't have any unity or balance, is a design that we don't really like very much. So we can see a really unbalanced design, perceive it that way, but really like it because it actually is in fact, well designed. Which I really like that kind of quality of designs, how we can really make them convey, any kind of mood or feeling or kind of concept, Okay, so let's see. Yeah, your design reminds me a little of Mondrian, the artist Mondrian, or Rene McIntosh. It has kind of like a early 20th century modern look to it. I'm trying to think of, there's specific design styles like De Stijl. I don't know if you've heard of any of those things, but you might want to look those up. Anyhow, yeah, I think this looks really good, and I agree with you too that the gray can really work nicely as a background. this kind of gray color kind of fill in the negative space. And what's nice about gray, or really a lot of more sort of subtle colors, if you're working with colors, you know, more neutral or desaturated colors, is that black and white tend to not actually work that well as background colors, interestingly enough. I mean, they work, you know, but they tend to often kind of, black tends to kind of be kind of a very strong presence, as does white, just because I think that they're so strong, you know, kind of at the extremes, whereas gray doesn't. Okay, yeah, I think this looks really good, you know, and so I only noticed just maybe a few small things in here I might play with. One, I love the idea of this circle, you know, kind of like being, you know, intersecting here. It seems like really a nice way to bring that circle in. And it kind of, I almost felt like I wanted to take this circle and move it here. I don't know if that would fit. It might be a bit cramped, so you might have to play with that, but I kind of feel like that's sort of an interesting way of sort of bringing that in. You know, and I like also too the way you have these angles, like these parallel lines in here. That's very nice. And then you also just kind of do this like, whoop, you know, where you make this like the one straight thing, which is an interesting idea. Um, I feel like this line here, I would be inclined to maybe either make it parallel to these angle lines, which I think would be quite easy to do. Maybe it could go 90 degrees with this angle. So this is like straight up and down. Maybe it could go horizontal if that works. But otherwise, I might be inclined to kind of angle it. It feels like it's the only thing that's doing that. And maybe it, you know, needs to change for that reason. This one here too, this angle also feels like it wants to be straight up and down, like it wants to be parallel, like that's the kind of line, like it's almost lining up here. You know, it's like one of those rules in design is when something appears to almost want to be something, like a certain angle or certain, you know, something, it's good to kind of push it that way. But we often don't see that. So it's often like when you, I bet when you look at it here today now, after you have had a chance not to see it for a while, it might, a lot of times those kinds of things are apparent, more apparent. Okay, I think that's it too. You know, maybe with the hexagon too, I'm wondering about the hexagon is maybe you could, it seems like it maybe got a little squished in here, which is not which is, there's nothing wrong with squishing, sometimes squishing shapes, but it almost feels like maybe it got squished and maybe it wants to be more hexagonal. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know if it bothers me that much, but I do think it would be nice to have more, like if you have one hexagon, maybe a few more. I don't know, maybe you could have hexagons within hexagons here. It could be its own little part, or you could put some hexagons somewhere else. Alternately, maybe you don't need a hexagon, you know? So yeah, anyhow, I think this is, yeah, you've just a few sort of small changes in here. Yeah, which is to be expected at the draft phase, really. There's always, I find personally, you know, I go through a lot of draft phases, just doing, kind of just looking at different, like, I sort of get the big picture, and then it's just about refining the small details. Okay, Mark, yes, adding the gray, yes, it's so much nicer to have gray. And you want to keep things simple. Always a great idea, I think, in design. No matter how far you get in design, I think keeping things simple is just always a really good philosophy. You'll find, you know, if you study some of the great designers of, you know, any era, that's, I think, the first thing that most people notice. You know, if you look at the graphic design field or really any field of design, is that it's very simple. You know, again, there's just a lot of, you know, pared down. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily minimal, but there's kind of a simplicity to it, like a lot of repetition. Okay, yeah, I really like what you're doing here too with kind of like the kind of movement that's going this way with these background shapes that are kind of pushing, you know, kind of starting here and moving upwards and repeating the lines. And then you've got these kind of repetition with some dots and some hexagons. And I like these little patterned areas. I think that's a very nice way to work. It's definitely pretty asymmetrical. You know, I might, with this design, you know, when you're working outside of a design class where we're focusing on asymmetrical or symmetrical, it doesn't really matter whether your design is perfectly symmetrical or perfectly asymmetrical, you know, as long as it works for what you're doing, you know. But I would say just because this this particular assignment is based so much on asymmetry, I'd be inclined to take this shape here, this big shape, which is, you know, it's like a really big part of your design. It sort of sits right in the center. Maybe move it off, like maybe to the side, you know, either side, you know, to kind of push, so just to kind of really push it away from being any sense of symmetry. Not that your design is symmetrical, but just kind of like because it sort of has this sense of being centered, it kind of gives that feeling, and we're really trying to move towards asymmetry. So I might just try that. Something else I might try too is, you know, when you work with outlines around shapes, I tend to, you know, think that outlines around shapes, in general, I'm not a fan of outlines around shapes just because I think that it kind of stops designs from interacting with with each other. They sort of stop the flow. It's almost like, you know, a stained glass window when you get those kind of little, like the parts, the kind of the leading in between the stained glass and how it flattens everything out. So in general, you know, but if you want to use outlines, then I say use them really strongly, like make it really thick, like, or thicker, so it becomes like almost like its shape on its own rather than just a border around things, if that makes sense. So I would experiment with that a little bit more. Yeah, I think that's about it. I'm not sure about the ladder effect in here. It feels like maybe it's too different from everything else. So I would be inclined to just kind of using the repetition, you know, maybe adding some more hexagons and these kind of cute little dots, you know, the gray dots, or some of these like kind of the sprinkling of dots, or just something maybe instead. Or, you know, maybe working that in, you know, maybe adding a few more repetitions of this, you know, putting the little, you know, ladders on different parts of the design. Okay, so I would just keep experimenting with this. I think it's got a lot of really interesting things happening in it. Yes, not balanced, but balanced. Yeah, you know, so like I mentioned earlier, I do think that, again, it's rare that I come across a design that's unbalanced. It's so interesting because, you know, a lot of other things I think we all have to work on, um, but somehow the balance seems to always happen. So, um, yeah, anyhow. So in your design, yeah, I love these stripes in here, kind of these pointy shapes. That's really interesting. And along with the hexagons, it's interesting because hexagons really they are about angles. Everything's kind of angled, you know, and then adding more angles starts to make the whole design be about angles. So you've got that kind of idea flowing through it, which I think is nice. So I would say in your design, the main thing that I would keep working on a little bit more, again, just like I mentioned earlier, is you've got a lot of outlines on here, and they feel a little, you know, did you notice, in I think it was, in our video for symmetry, I believe the tutorial talked about strokes and how to work with them, and, you know, how to turn them off. And I would be inclined in yours to do what I suggested before, to either make your strokes bigger so they really stand out, so they become like thicker, you know, or take them all off. You know, click on the shapes and just turn them all off, and let the shapes just become, you know, because a lot of times what's happening here, so you got these little kind of little bits and pieces. It starts getting very kind of, we can't really see them that well, but they tend to disturb the movement and flow through the design. So that's one of the main things. The other thing I would work on, I don't have, you know, I'm not able to see your PSD or AI file, so I don't know if this is what's happening, but sometimes when you start, and this is actually, I'm glad that we're able to talk about it in terms of your design, because this could help other folks. Gray is, now let me just go into Photoshop here. Now this will work the same in Photoshop or Illustrator. Let's see here, I'm going to go to your design. Here it is. Here's your design. And let me actually, I'm going to just move things around here. Okay, hopefully you can see the menu at the top. So when you create a design, what happens is if you're working in color, and you're probably going to be in color, You can go up to image and mode here and check. You can go to your Photoshop or your Illustrator file and go pretty much the same place, image mode, and actually see these are the modes that what you're doing is you're telling Illustrator or Photoshop, do you want color or do you want no color or grayscale? And color is really all of these things here, right in here. RGB just means color. It's just, you know, it doesn't matter. It is color. And grayscale, when you work, and you can actually turn this, you can open your original file, your PSD or AI file, and actually change it right in here. Even though you've finished your design, you can change it to grayscale. I'm not going to do that next. It's not going to probably make much difference here on this design. But what that does is it will change the colors that you can choose. So right now, okay, this is in the color picker right here. If you look in here, so if you look here, so I'm kind of picking grays here, right in here, right along this part of the color picker. That's all gray, but because I'm actually in a color, I'm able to pick colors. This is actually red, and this is a gray based on red. It's actually not just gray, it's a gray based on red. So if we change it to a blue, then we would have a gray that actually looks quite a bit bluer. You know, if you go to the paint store, if you ever gone to the paint store and you see that whole row, like you go to the grays or the blacks or the whites, doesn't matter, either one of those things, and you pick up two of the same, like you pick two grays that look so close and you put them side by side, you'll see one kind of looks warmer, one looks a little cooler. They look different. And that's what's happening here. I think possibly is like maybe in here, because this looks like maybe cooler, this could be warmer, and it's so making the grays not really appear like they quite belong together. So you can, again, it's easy to fix that by just going in there and changing your color mode. And you can do that anytime you're working on a black and white design, whether it's for this class or somewhere else. It can just make things a lot easier. Okay, so I think that's the main thing I would work on here. See if you can, you know, or feel free to experiment a little bit more as well. Okay, Jamie. Yeah, I love the idea of working with triangles. I think that's a really nice way, into triangles and circles. I think that's a really great way to work. What I would say is actually similar to something I mentioned before, is that even though your design is technically asymmetrical, it would be nice if you just push this a little further into asymmetry, since that's what we really want to kind of convey in this particular assignment. So I would just move these like triangles off to the left or the right, and then just readjust your design around those, you know, and that way it'll start appearing, you know, more automatically more asymmetrical. Then what I might do is just keep experimenting a little bit more. I would also maybe take this black outline out at this point. I like starting to like the way it's framing. You know, you're working with a kind of a thicker line here that's maybe going to become like almost like a rectangle. So maybe, you know, play up those, you know, I love that idea here, play it up a little bit more, making it a little thicker. Then just kind of keep experimenting, moving things around, adjusting. I'm wondering down here, you know, sometimes so different colored grays, they're a little bit similar in value. I might consider making them either lighter or darker, one lighter or darker, so you get more contrast. Sometimes when things are just a little bit, a smidge apart in terms of color, then it looks kind of like accidental. So we want to make it look more intentional. I could also see you working here with like one color of gray and then white, and sort of chopping little pieces out to kind of get these maybe more complexity in your forms. You know how like we kind of did that back in Milestone 1, where we took one shape and overlapped it, black and white shapes, and then you got these interesting cutouts. So you might try working with that as well. Yeah, so keep experimenting and, you know, kind of really pushing it towards being asymmetrical. Yes, easy. Yes, sometimes design is easy. It's interesting how that works, doesn't it? It seems like, what is it, like something in the water or, you know, in the air, you know, like where designs suddenly come together, and other times they are hard, they're more challenging, you know. It really, I find it really doesn't, you just don't know. But I actually think this turned out really well. You know, I really like the way that you're kind of building all of these shapes in, kind of building them with that idea of overlapping where the positive and negative starts interlocking, which I just think is so cool to be able to do that. I really like that. So I would say just only a couple things here. I might be inclined to move this guy off to the left or the right so that it's not so centered. Again, even though your design is asymmetrical, just again to just push that concept a little bit more. The other thing I might do is make some of these or all of these shapes maybe a touch bigger to fill in the negative space. You know, it feels like there's a little bit of a sense that they're floating in a lot of negative space and maybe having a little less of that white space, negative space, you know. Maybe you don't fit them all in, or maybe they kind of peel off the page a little bit more, and that's okay as you make them bigger. And then I might, as you make them bigger, what one might naturally happen is you might get these little, these lines maybe getting a little larger, because I think they could be a little larger. They feel, sometimes when we're working in design, I feel like I do this, I sometimes make my design quite a bit larger on the screen, and then it goes down to its sort of natural size and some of the details lost, and maybe that's what happened, or maybe you have really good eyesight. But I might just kind of make those like those lines a little bit thicker if they, you know, just a little bit more so that those lines are a little bit more obvious. And I think the reason why your outlines or strokes are working here, you know, I've been mentioning to other folks that maybe they should either make them thicker or take them off. But the reason why I think it's working in your design is because they're working as they're integrated into the space of the design. So they're actually part of the negative space here. So we're kind of flowing through these lines. You know, they're kind of interwoven into the design. Also, the way these lines are, you see here, they're kind of visually connecting different parts. And that's, so they have a sense of really belonging and being necessary to the, or almost not even necessary to design, a kind of like a part of the way the design is I can't really describe it, but they have a sense of this part of being part of the spatial qualities of the design. So it's a little bit of a different thing. Okay, all right, everybody. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I think everybody did a really great job understanding asymmetry and creating some really interesting designs. And this is our last group critique. I'll be popping into the classroom until, I guess, I'll probably come in tomorrow and Wednesday, so if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, your final submission is due on Wednesday. Do make sure to answer all of the questions in the, the final submission area. There's typically 4 questions, so just answer them all to the best of your ability. I'm really less interested in how correct your answers are, in that you do just address, you address the questions, whatever the questions are. All right? Okay.